This is Amanda from Willow and Pip, and today I'm taking you behind the scenes on how I make my luxury coconut wax candles. I store all of my candles in these boxes of 12. I just reuse the same box from which I bought the vessels. And so when I start to prep for my candle wax making, I open up each of my different boxes where I have them labeled and make a quick count of how many of each kind I need to make. Next, I prep my wax warmer. And for my coconut apricot wax, I turn it to 200 degrees and will heat about an hour it'll take to get this pot fully liquid for melting. And I always make sure that I top my melting pot up with wax. I get used to how much to add here. It's really by eye, but basically I just fill it up so that I can take full advantage of the time it takes to melt. I'm now prepping my jars. I actually had these jars sitting out for a couple of weeks on another counter, so I'm just giving the tops a quick wipe just to make sure everything is lint-free. And I am prepping now by removing the lids. I'll turn the jars over. I try to do everything as quickly, efficiently as possible, but I like to work in batches like this. So when I turn the jars over, it just preps it for the next step where I add the caution label to the bottom of each of the vessels. I pre-buy all of my caution labels from Amazon in a roll. I'll show you and slow down the clip here in a second to show you what that looks like. Nothing fancy, but it meets the label requirements to add, the cautions: don't leave your candle, burning unattended, make sure you trim your wicks. But each candle gets one of those on the bottom, as you can see me applying here. And then once I'm through this part of the prep, I will flip each of the vessels right side up and start with adding my wick tabs. For these candles, I do order professional labels. These are from Sticker Mule, and I just keep them on a shelf here nice and handy, and I'll reorder more as I need. So I have, again, pre-counted, pre-selected which types of candles I'm going to be making today. So I'm just starting with my plum, moscato, and almond. You can see this roll is pretty near the end, but I'll use up each and every label, of course, as you would. So back to the wicking stage, I get these candle wick tabs off of Amazon. They're a double-sided sticky wick tab, and these are CDN 10 size wicks. You could use a CDN 10 or a CDN 8 for these types of vessels. I'm using the CDN 10. And I also use a pen. So I'll just make sure if you're using a pen, if it's a push pen, make sure obviously that you're not going to have the ink. So I pushed it in so that I'm just using it as a tool. So I'm not actually marking the wicks at all with the ink side. So I will place the sticky wick tab on the bottom of that metal wick tab and peel away the sticker and use the pen just to kind of give it a little firm press, and it adheres to the bottom quite nicely this way. I do know a lot of people will use a wick centering tool. I just eyeball it. You can see really clearly where the center of the vessel is when you look down, and I have never had an issue where my candle hasn't burnt through thoroughly or any other type of adherence issues with wick tabs by doing it this way. So I think it's just the way I learned, but I do know there's other ways to do this. Now, I prefer to add my candle labels to my candle vessels before I pour the wax. And a lot of people don't do this. A lot of people will pour the wax and then add the vessel. But again, it's the way I like it's kind of the order that I like to run things in. I find by the time I pour my candle wax and go back the next day to trim the wick and add the lid, I just sort of want to be done. I also find that by adding the label at this stage, it just helps me keep track. I don't have to write the fragrance on a sticky note. That's what I used to do when I first started, and try to keep track that way. This way it's just really clear what the fragrance that you poured is for. However, there's a little bit of an extra tip for this in that make sure when you're pouring your wax, you've got your candle label facing the opposite direction, so that should you accidentally drizzle a little bit of the hot wax down the side of the vessel, it's not going to hit the label and won't have an issue there where you'd have to potentially peel off a label and reapply a clean one. So as I apply each of the labels for each of the vessels, I just place them on the table, which is right beside this cart that I'm working off of, and get them lined up in a row or in a grouping together so that I just keep track for the next step before I get ready to pour my fragrance into the hot wax, mix, and then pour into the vessel. I pre-print out and have these right at my candle pouring stations. These are the wax to fragrance calculators, and what this is a cheat sheet, if you will, of how many vessels to pick versus how many ounces of wax I need to pour and how many ounces of fragrance oil. So for example, for 4 jars, I need 26 ounces of wax and 1.82 ounces of fragrance oil, and that's a 7% oil loading. You're welcome to pause the video there if you want to do something similar or use my cheat sheet. So before I start pouring in my fragrance oil, I will tear out my scale, make sure it's in ounces, and I'm going to pour that 26 ounces of wax, of liquid hot wax, into my pouring pitcher. One thing also of note is I can never pour 26 ounces right on the nose. So if it's slightly over, that's okay. I have pre-measured out so that, of course, the wax isn't going to go right to the very tip of the edge of the vessel. I do have a little bit of wiggle room there. So you can see I've got 26.45 or 26.50 waxes, or 50 ounces. That's about right for what I'm looking to do. So now I'm going to tear again, and next I'll add my fragrance oil. But before I do, I want to check the temperature. So I set the temperature of this wax melter to 200 degrees. However, it's heated it just past 210 degrees there. So I had to wait until my wax melted down or cooled off down to 185 degrees before I add the fragrance oil, and that's just based on the manufacturing recommendation. So I've added my fragrance oil at 185 degrees, and now I am mixing. It's also really important to mix for a good period of time. I recommend 2 minutes, and I actually have a stopwatch where I will literally punch in 2 minutes and stir for that period of time. I find if I don't do that, I usually rush this stage and lose track. It ends up usually being about 30 seconds, and that's obviously too quick of time. And the reason you want to stir your fragrance oil for 2 minutes is it helps the fragrance molecules just blend well with the wax, so that when it hardens and cures, and of course final burn, you're going to have just a thoroughly mixed scent blend the way that the manufacturer intended it to be blended. I pour my wax right from the waxing or the pouring pitchers themselves. I do see a lot of people using funnels. I've actually just recently bought a new funnel because I am going to be making some little sample 2-ounce candle tins, and so I'll need something more precise. I'll let you know how that goes in some future videos, but for these wider mouth vessels, I do like just pouring straight from the pouring pitcher. I find if you pour high enough away and quick enough, I've never had any kind of dribbling issues. Every once in a while I'll get maybe a small drip on the paper that I set out there under my vessels, but other than that, I've never had any big spills or issues. So I will pour my wax in, and then I will use I like these metal wick centering tools. They're quite simple to use, but again, there's all kinds of products out there. This is just what I started using and never looked for anything different. I suppose the one downside of these is the holes for the wick aren't completely centered, so you sort of have to offset that tin, but it's quite straightforward. You just place it on top of the vessel. And actually, The way that I do it, you could see the metal clip is kind of concave. I think actually you're supposed to do it the other way around, but it's just not what I ever did. I actually didn't realize I was probably doing this backwards or upside down until probably a year into my candle making journey. And so, if it's not broken, don't fix it. I just left it the way it is. But if you're starting out, you may want to place them the other side around because you can see obviously it's concave for like the size of that rim around the vessel, and it is meant to sit, the way it's designed. So I will just continue on like this, pouring my candles. Depending on how many I have to make, it can take several hours or, 30 minutes to an hour at a time. I do try to do everything again in batch. So um, this whole table will be full of candle vessels and obviously poured wax by the time I'm through the afternoon. The candle wax does need to cure, so I will leave these candles on this table for a full 24 hours. I will then proceed with taking off those metal clips and cutting the wicks down to about a quarter of an inch above the dried wax. I'll then put the lid on the candle and put the candle vessels back in those boxes on the shelf until I go to market or I get an order. Um, this type of wax you do want to leave for a week to 2 weeks full cure time before you do burn. And again, you can find that on the wax manufacturer information on the website that you order your candle wax from. I hope this video helps you in your candle making journey. For more content, please like and subscribe.